Joining us now, national political correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC and the author of The Red and the Blue, Steve Kornacki, and Republican communications strategist and an MSNBC political contributor, Rick Tyler. Gentlemen, good morning. We are 1 week away from the midterm elections. President Trump's multi-state campaign swing will not bring him to Arizona, though, a state he won in 2016. And new numbers in that state's U.S. Senate race show the Democrat doubling her lead from last month. The NBC News Marist poll shows Congresswoman Kyrsten Sinema with 50% of the vote, a 6-point lead over Republican Congresswoman Martha McSally at 44%. That was a 3-point race back in September. McSally's vote percentage lines up with President Trump's approval rating in the state, 44% according to the poll, 49% disapprove. Steve, what's happening in Arizona?
Yeah, I think that number right there is the key to have Trump's approval at 44%. Sort of as goes Trump's approval rating, so goes the fortunes of Republican candidates. We're seeing that. The other significant thing I think here, too, is Republicans were hopeful that the past few weeks in terms of sort of opposition research that had emerged about Kyrsten Sinema, all sorts of comments she'd made in the past 5 years when she was a more sort of activist, liberal-oriented politician. She'd gone to a number of events, number of conferences, made very sort of controversial statements sort of about her state, about Arizona. They thought that was going to erode her sort of standing in the state more. You ask in this poll the favorable, unfavorable, the personal rating for the candidates. Sinema still in this poll outrating McSally in that. McSally running at the Trump approval number and Sinema ahead by 6 points here. This one's a very encouraging poll for Democrats.
You know, Rick Tyler, I think what's so interesting is you see these numbers move, and they've moved pretty quickly because you actually had McSally up by 3 points last week in other polls.
Amazing.
But there was that moment, and it was just, it's, as you know better than all of us, because you've been in the middle of it, you can have a moment, a campaign that defines a campaign. Here, we're talking about health care, and as she's being bombarded with questions about opposing pre-existing conditions, and she's being bombarded with questions from the press about her own people on Obamacare, she says, come on, why don't we talk about an issue that's important to people? Why don't we talk about the caravan? Man, that is one of those moments that that looking back, if they don't win this campaign, they're going to want that moment back, because that's where she told Arizona voters she believed a phony story about a caravan was more important than the real story about health care in Arizona.
Yeah, Joe, in any election, talking about health care as if it's not an important issue is really sort of ridiculous, but especially now. But these races, in the final week, they start to tighten up, and it's hard to overcome the momentum. I think the Republicans really did have a bad week, and this race is about one thing. I mean, the Democratic message really is it's about Donald Trump, and to me it's not a coincidence that his poll numbers or his approval ratings in Arizona, which is a state, by the way, he's not very popular. Remember, Arizona loved John McCain, and Donald Trump not so much liking John McCain. So that seat looks to me like it's a likely pickup for Democrats.
Let's hop over to the high-profile Senate race in the state of Texas. It gives Republican Senator Ted Cruz a lead in the Quinnipiac poll, 51% to 46% for Democratic Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who's down 5 points after trailing in this poll by 9 points earlier this month. What's the movement here, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, there's a question of if there is significant movement or not. I mean, this does continue the trend of essentially every poll since Labor Day's had Ted Cruz ahead, right, sometimes in the mid-single digits, sometimes in the high single digits. There had been one there, I think, in the first 10 days or so of September that put O'Rourke ahead by 2 points. That's the only one I've seen. So in this race, look, Democrats are counting on this idea of, one thing I think they're encouraged by is that nationally, our poll showed this last week, there's been a surge of interest among Latino voters in the midterm elections. They're hoping, Democrats are, that in a state like Texas, that translates into a boost of a couple points for them. You might be seeing that here a little bit. Ted Cruz, though, continues, you should say, in Texas, Republicans tend to do fairly well compared to how they do nationally with the Latino vote, and Cruz getting, between 35-40% of the Latino vote. But I think that's one of those areas where Democrats hope that down the stretch, there's been a spike of interest among Latino voters that could boost them in states like this.
I mean, that is just absolutely so critical. Rick Tyler, I want to give you. I was reading an article last night from 538, and they were saying that Democrats only have a 1 in 6 chance of taking back the Senate, but about an 80% chance of taking back the House. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, I think on election day, Steve and I were talking this before coming on camera. I think this election is going to be really a mixed bag. I think there'll be a lot for everyone, for both sides to sort of brag about. It seems to me that the Democrats will probably pick up the House. Remember, all the conventional metrics, the way we measure off-year elections, people are spooked because Donald Trump won, and no one had predicted that. But it was very hard to look at that race and the Electoral College and believe that Donald Trump would win. I mean, it's just he ran the table and he won, and that's that. But in an off-year election, there is no Electoral College, so we can go back to looking at the favorability, the right track, wrong track, the generic ballot, and then you start going down the individual races, and you start looking at all the races that the Republicans walked away from. I think there's 41 incumbents that walked away from their seat. It's hard to imagine the Democrats won't do well. Now, in the Senate, it's probably a different story. It seems likely that the Democrats will not win the Senate, and the Republicans will marginally hold on to it, which will enable Donald Trump to say in an off-year election, you know, we had the best off-year election since who knows when. So I think everybody will sort of claim victory here.
Yeah, and Steve Kornacki also in this 538 article, I found it interesting that the conclusion was that Democrats are more likely than not, even though a lot of close races, more likely than not, looking at the polls, to squeak it out in Indiana, Missouri, and win comfortably in Florida, but lose pretty handily in North Dakota, Tennessee, and Texas. Does that sound about right to you?
Well, yeah, and that's it. Those three, just in terms of the question of Senate control, if Democrats don't win one of those last three you just mentioned, North Dakota, where we got two polls now showing Heitkamp, the Democrat, down double digits. This is state Trump won by 36 points. That one seems, that seems to be fading away very fast for Democrats. Tennessee, where Marsha Blackburn has improved her standing over the last, month to 6 weeks, but Democrats still in striking distance there, or Texas, which we just talked about. Unless Democrats win one of those three, they are not even in the game for Senate control.
So, Steve, as you do almost every morning, you've brought us an exclusive new poll. This one from Monmouth University, New York's 19th congressional district. What does the number show you, and why is it a significant district to look at?
I think this is a very significant finding. What you're looking at here is a Republican-held seat. That's an incumbent Republican there, John Faso, losing in this poll that Monmouth has taken. Very good pollster to his Democratic challenger, Antonio Delgado. That is a 5-point margin. The district we're talking about here, there's a lot of these in upstate New York. This one, it went from Obama in 2012 to Trump in 2016. It's a pivot district. It went from Obama to Trump. Trump did better than expected here. It helped Faso get elected in 2016. He's now running for re-election in 2018. You see Trump's approval rating in this district is not far off where Faso is running. It's that same dynamic in Monmouth in this poll. They say the other thing that they're seeing just in the last week, and remember, this poll was conducted concurrently with the bombs that were sent last week, and even with at the end of it with the Pittsburgh tragedy over the weekend, they're seeing a jump in Democratic support among women, too. These are sort of the outer suburbs of New York City into rural areas, and you see there it's an Obama-Trump district where now the Democrat leads by 5 points. That's the kind of district, if you can add that to these suburban seats that we've been talking about Democrats being so well positioned in, you start talking about potentially not just Democrats getting the House, but maybe Democrats getting the House by a sizable margin.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.